The most dangerous myth of our age masquerades as compassion while systematically destroying the very foundations of human liberty. For decades, I have watched as the ideology of enforced equality, what the ancients would have recognized as the sin of envy codified into law, has penetrated every institution of American life. This is not the equality before the law that our founding fathers wisely established, but rather a revolutionary doctrine that seeks to remake human nature itself. The equality ideologues promise utopia through the elimination of all distinctions, all hierarchies, all excellence. Yet history teaches us that such attempts invariably produce not paradise, but tyranny. Today, we witness the fulfillment of Tocqueville's prophetic warnings about democratic despotism, as the pursuit of absolute equality becomes the enemy of genuine freedom. The permanent things, tradition, order, justice, and liberty properly understood, stand under assault by those who would sacrifice civilization itself upon the altar of their egalitarian abstractions. We must understand why true conservatism recognizes that authentic human flourishing requires not the abolition of differences, but their proper ordering according to merit, virtue, and the transcendent purposes that give meaning to existence. Chapter 1: The Confusion of Equality, Justice versus Egalitarianism. During my years studying the development of conservative thought, I have come to understand that the corruption of language inevitably precedes the corruption of institutions. Nowhere is this more evident than in the modern misuse of the word equality. The founding fathers spoke of equality before the law, the revolutionary principle that no man, regardless of birth or station, should be exempt from justice or excluded from its protection. This was indeed a radical departure from the aristocratic privileges of the old world, and it represented genuine progress in human governance. Yet the equality ideologues of our time have perverted this noble concept into something unrecognizable and deeply destructive. The egalitarian mind cannot distinguish between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, between justice and uniformity, between the elimination of artificial barriers and the elimination of natural differences. They have transformed Jefferson's assertion that all men are created equal, from a statement about inherent human dignity and natural rights into a demand that all men must be made equal in every measurable respect. This transformation represents not merely a political error, but a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature and the moral order. True equality before the law recognizes that while all human beings possess inherent dignity as creatures made in the image of God, they differ vastly in their talents, efforts, choices, and circumstances. Justice consists in treating like cases alike, ensuring that the law applies equally to rich and poor, powerful and weak. But egalitarian ideology demands that we treat unlike cases as if they were identical, which is the very definition of injustice. The conservative understanding, rooted in centuries of experience and reflection, acknowledges what G.K. Chesterton called the inequality of equality, the recognition that human beings are equal in their essential dignity but wonderfully diverse in their gifts and capacities. This diversity is not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature of the divine design that enriches human society and makes possible the complex cooperation that characterizes civilized life. When egalitarians demand equity rather than equality, they reveal their true purpose, not the protection of individual rights, but the redistribution of outcomes according to their own vision of social justice. This represents a fundamental shift from a system of laws to a system of men, from objective standards applied impartially to subjective preferences imposed by force. Let me expand this chapter to meet the required character count. The conservative mind recognizes that the attempt to achieve substantive equality of condition necessarily destroys procedural equality before the law. When government begins to mandate equal outcomes, it must inevitably treat citizens unequally in the process. The university admissions officer who practices racial preferences, the employer who hires based on demographic quotas rather than merit, the judge who considers group identity rather than individual circumstances, all violate the principle of equal treatment in service of egalitarian goals. This corruption spreads throughout society like a cancer. Once we accept that some citizens may be treated differently based on their membership in preferred groups, we have abandoned the rule of law for the rule of ideology. The egalitarian state must constantly expand its power to monitor, measure, and manipulate social outcomes, creating the very bureaucratic despotism that classical liberals sought to prevent. Moreover, the pursuit of enforced equality inevitably punishes excellence and rewards mediocrity. When differences in achievement are automatically attributed to systemic discrimination rather than individual effort and ability, society loses the incentive structures that encourage human flourishing. The result is not equality, but the equality of decline, what Winston Churchill aptly called the equal sharing of miseries. Chapter 2: The Destruction of Natural Hierarchy Through Ideological Leveling. Among the most pernicious effects of equality ideology is its systematic assault upon natural hierarchy, those organic distinctions based on wisdom, virtue, experience, and achievement that have sustained human civilization throughout history. The egalitarian mind cannot tolerate the existence of any form of ranking or gradation, viewing all hierarchies as artificial constructs imposed by oppressive power structures rather than natural developments arising from human diversity and merit. Yet hierarchy is as natural to human society as it is to the physical universe itself. Just as we observe gradations of complexity from the simplest particles to the most sophisticated organisms, so too do we find in human affairs natural distinctions between teacher and student, parent and child, expert and novice, leader and follower. These relationships are not arbitrary impositions, but functional necessities that allow for the transmission of knowledge, the maintenance of order, and the cultivation of excellence. The traditional understanding recognizes that hierarchy, properly ordered, serves human flourishing rather than hindering it. The master craftsman who guides the apprentice, the experienced judge who instructs the young lawyer, the wise elder who counsels the community, these relationships embody the democracy of the dead that Edmund Burke described, the means by which accumulated wisdom passes from generation to generation. But equality ideology views all such distinctions with suspicion, interpreting them through the lens of power dynamics and oppression narratives. The professor's authority over students becomes an exercise in domination rather than education. The parent's guidance of children becomes an assertion of arbitrary control rather than loving formation. The employer's evaluation of workers becomes systemic discrimination rather than necessary management. This leveling impulse extends beyond formal institutions to attack the very foundations of culture and tradition. When egalitarians encounter the great works of literature, art, and philosophy that have shaped Western civilization, they do not see accumulated wisdom worthy of reverence and study, but rather the products of privileged elites that must be deconstructed, critiqued, and ultimately replaced with more inclusive alternatives. The result is the phenomenon I have termed the equality of ignorance, the deliberate reduction of educational and cultural standards to accommodate the lowest common denominator. Rather than inspiring students to rise to the level of excellence represented by the great tradition, contemporary education increasingly brings that tradition down to the level of contemporary sensibilities. This destructive process manifests itself in the ongoing degradation of our universities, where academic excellence gives way to ideological conformity, where the pursuit of truth surrenders to the advancement of social justice, and where the cultivation of wisdom is replaced by the indoctrination of activists. The ancient motto veritas is abandoned in favor of diversitas, as if truth itself were somehow oppressive to those who cannot or will not pursue it. Chapter 3: How Forced Equality Becomes Tyranny, the Democracy of Envy. The wisdom of our ancestors, which I have spent a lifetime studying and defending, provides clear warnings about the dangers of egalitarian excess. The democracy of the dead, that great council of human experience spanning millennia, speaks with one voice in condemning the attempt to achieve perfect equality among imperfect beings. From Aristotle's analysis of democracy's tendency toward mob rule to Tocqueville's prescient observations about democratic despotism, the great political philosophers have understood that the unlimited pursuit of equality inevitably destroys both liberty and genuine democracy. The Founding Fathers, steeped in this classical wisdom, designed our constitutional system with elaborate checks and balances precisely to prevent the tyranny of temporary majorities animated by egalitarian passion. They understood that democracy, without constitutional restraints and moral foundations, tends to degenerate into what James Madison called the violence of faction, the use of governmental power by organized groups to advance their particular interests at the expense of the common good. Yet the equality ideologues of our time have systematically dismantled these constitutional safeguards in the name of democratic progress. They treat the Constitution not as a charter of limited government protecting individual rights, but as an obstacle to social transformation that must be circumvented or reinterpreted beyond recognition. When constitutional principles conflict with egalitarian goals, it is invariably the Constitution that must yield. Consider how the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, originally intended to ensure that former slaves received the same legal protections as other citizens, has been perverted into a mandate for affirmative action programs that explicitly discriminate on the basis of race. Or observe how the First Amendment's guarantee of religious freedom has been subordinated to anti-discrimination laws that force religious institutions to violate their own moral teachings. This pattern reveals the totalitarian logic inherent in equality ideology. Because natural human differences persistently reassert themselves despite governmental intervention, the egalitarian state must exercise ever greater control over society to suppress these differences. What begins as a modest program to ensure equal opportunity inevitably expands into comprehensive social engineering that regulates speech, association, commerce, education, and ultimately thought itself. The French revolutionaries, those harbingers of modern egalitarianism, demonstrated this logic with terrifying clarity. Their initial demands for equality before the law quickly escalated into the reign of terror, as the revolutionary government attempted to remake human nature itself through force. As Burke observed with prophetic insight, when men seek to create heaven on earth, they succeed only in creating hell. The contemporary American experience follows this same trajectory, though with less dramatic violence. Our equality commissars prefer bureaucratic coercion to guillotines, but the underlying logic remains the same. Those who resist the egalitarian transformation must be re-educated, marginalized, or eliminated from public life. The result is what I have called the soft despotism of the administrative state, a form of tyranny that enslaves through regulation rather than revolution. Chapter 4: The Moral Order versus Egalitarian Nihilism. Throughout my exploration of conservative principles, I have consistently emphasized that political order must rest upon moral order, and moral order must ultimately derive from transcendent sources. The equality ideology of our time represents a fundamental rejection of this hierarchical understanding of reality in favor of a flattened materialism that recognizes no authority higher than human will and no standard beyond subjective preference. The traditional Western understanding, rooted in both classical philosophy and Christian revelation, recognizes that human beings exist within a great chain of being that extends from the material realm through the spiritual to the divine. This cosmic hierarchy provides both meaning and moral guidance, establishing objective standards of right and wrong that transcend individual opinion and cultural fashion. Human equality, properly understood, consists not in the denial of this hierarchy but in the recognition that all humans occupy the same essential position within it, above the beasts, below the angels, and dependent upon God for their ultimate purpose and destiny. Egalitarian ideology systematically rejects this transcendent framework in favor of what I have termed the religion of humanity. In this secular faith, Human beings become the measure of all things, and equality becomes not a means to justice but an end in itself. Without reference to transcendent standards, equality becomes purely arbitrary, a matter of political preference rather than moral principle. The consequences of this nihilistic foundation manifest themselves in the incoherence and instability of egalitarian programs. Without objective criteria for determining what constitutes unjust inequality, egalitarians must constantly revise their standards to accommodate new grievances and novel forms of oppression. Yesterday's progress becomes today's injustice as the definition of equality expands to encompass ever more exotic forms of difference. We observe this pattern in the evolution of civil rights discourse, which has moved from the classical liberal demand for colorblind justice to increasingly elaborate theories of intersectionality that fragment society into competing identity groups, each claiming unique forms of oppression that require special remedies. The result is not unity but division, not justice but a war of all against all as different groups compete for victim status and the political advantages that accompany it. This fragmentation reveals the deeper problem with egalitarian morality, its inability to provide a coherent account of human dignity and social obligation. If human beings are merely material creatures shaped by social forces, then their equality becomes a mere convention that can be redefined at will. If there are no transcendent standards of justice, then equality becomes simply another form of power politics disguised in moral language. The conservative alternative insists that human dignity derives not from social consensus but from divine creation, and that justice consists not in the elimination of differences but in their proper ordering according to objective moral standards. This understanding provides both the foundation for genuine equality before the law and the limits necessary to prevent egalitarian excess from destroying the very foundations of civilized life. Chapter 5: The natural diversity that enriches human society. During my decades of reflection on conservative principles, I have come to appreciate that one of the greatest gifts of divine providence is the wonderful diversity of human talents, temperaments, and capacities. This diversity is not an accident to be corrected or a problem to be solved, but rather the foundation of all human cooperation and the source of civilization's greatest achievements. The equality ideologues of our time, in their relentless pursuit of uniformity, seek to destroy this natural diversity in the name of justice, not understanding that they thereby destroy the very conditions that make justice possible. Consider the simple fact that human beings differ enormously in their intellectual abilities, creative gifts, physical capacities, and moral development. Some individuals possess exceptional talents in mathematics or music, while others excel in leadership or craftsmanship. Some are naturally inclined toward contemplation and study, while others thrive in practical endeavors. These differences are not arbitrary social constructions imposed by oppressive power structures, but natural endowments that reflect the infinite creativity of divine providence. The traditional understanding recognizes these differences as complementary rather than competitive. The community that includes both the philosopher and the farmer, the artist and the engineer, the teacher and the entrepreneur, enjoys a richness and complexity that would be impossible in a society of identical individuals. Each person contributes according to his unique gifts, and all benefit from the diverse talents that others bring to the common enterprise of civilization. Yet equality ideology cannot tolerate such natural diversity because it conflicts with the egalitarian assumption that all differences in outcome must result from discrimination or injustice. When some students excel in mathematics while others struggle, egalitarians do not celebrate the mathematical gifts of the talented or seek to help the struggling students develop their own unique abilities. Instead, they conclude that the educational system itself must be biased against those who perform poorly, and they implement policies designed to eliminate achievement gaps by reducing standards for all. This destructive logic extends throughout society. When some ethnic groups achieve greater economic success than others, Egalitarians automatically assume systemic discrimination rather than considering the possibility that different groups might possess different cultural values, work ethics, or educational priorities. When men and women make different career choices and achieve different outcomes, egalitarians blame patriarchal oppression rather than acknowledging that the sexes might have different interests and aptitudes. The result is a systematic war against excellence in all its forms. Gifted programs are eliminated because they create hierarchies. Merit-based selection is abandoned because it produces unequal outcomes. Standards are lowered to ensure that everyone can succeed, which paradoxically ensures that no one truly succeeds because success loses all meaning when it is guaranteed to everyone regardless of effort or achievement. This egalitarian assault on diversity ultimately impoverishes everyone, including those it claims to help. When we eliminate the possibility of failure, we also eliminate the possibility of genuine achievement. When we refuse to acknowledge differences in ability and effort, we destroy the incentive structures that encourage human development and excellence. Chapter 6: Political Prudence Against Ideological Radicalism. The practice of politics, as I have learned through years of study and occasional participation, requires above all the virtue of prudence, that practical wisdom which enables statesmen to navigate between competing goods and to achieve the possible rather than demanding the perfect. The equality ideologues of our time have abandoned prudence in favor of ideology, substituting abstract theories for practical experience and demanding immediate transformation regardless of consequences. True political prudence recognizes that human nature is relatively fixed and that social institutions develop organically over long periods of time in response to genuine human needs and limitations. The prudent statesman works within these constraints, seeking gradual improvements that preserve what is valuable while carefully correcting what is genuinely defective. He understands that radical changes, however well-intentioned, often produce results opposite to those intended, and that the disruption of social order typically harms the very people that reform is meant to help. The egalitarian ideologue, by contrast, begins with abstract theories about how society ought to be organized and then attempts to remake reality to conform to these theories. When reality resists, as it invariably does, the ideologue concludes not that his theories are flawed, but that reality must be transformed more completely. This leads to the escalating radicalism we observe in contemporary politics, where each failure of egalitarian policy is met not with reconsideration but with demands for more extensive intervention. We have witnessed this pattern repeatedly in American social policy over the past half-century. The war on poverty, launched with great fanfare and enormous expenditure, has failed to reduce poverty rates despite trillions of dollars in spending. Rather than acknowledging that welfare programs might actually perpetuate the problems they claim to solve, egalitarian politicians demand ever more ambitious programs and greater government control over social outcomes. Similarly, decades of educational reform based on egalitarian principles have produced declining academic achievement and increasing social division. Rather than returning to traditional pedagogical methods that emphasized excellence and individual responsibility, educational bureaucrats double down on failed innovations, always promising that the next reform will finally achieve the equality of outcomes that has proven so elusive. This ideological blindness prevents egalitarians from learning from experience or adapting their policies to changing circumstances. Because their commitment to equality is fundamentally religious rather than empirical, no amount of contrary evidence can shake their faith in the ultimate achievability of their goals. They interpret every failure as proof that their efforts have been insufficient rather than misdirected, leading to an endless spiral of governmental expansion and social disruption. The conservative alternative insists that political prudence must take precedence over ideological purity. We prefer reforms that build upon existing institutions rather than destroying them, that work with human nature rather than against it, and that preserve social stability while addressing genuine injustices. We understand that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that the attempt to create heaven on earth typically creates hell instead. Chapter 7. Defending the permanent things against egalitarian destruction. As I have reflected throughout my career on what I have called the permanent things, those enduring truths and values that transcend historical epochs, I have come to understand that the greatest threat to these eternal principles comes not from external enemies but from internal corruption. The equality ideology represents such a corruption, attacking the very foundations of Western civilization in the name of justice and progress while actually undermining both. The permanent things include those fundamental truths about human nature, moral order, and social organization that have sustained civilized life throughout history. They encompass the recognition that human beings are created in the image of God and possess inherent dignity, that moral standards derive from transcendent sources rather than human convention, that authority must be based on wisdom and virtue rather than mere power, that tradition preserves accumulated wisdom and should be changed only with great caution, and that genuine community requires both individual responsibility and mutual obligation. Each of these permanent things comes under systematic attack from equality ideology. The recognition of inherent human dignity is perverted into a demand for identical treatment that denies real differences in character and capacity. Transcendent moral standards are rejected in favor of relativistic values that change with social fashion. Traditional authority based on wisdom and experience is replaced by bureaucratic power justified by credentials and ideology. The wisdom of tradition is dismissed as the prejudice of oppressive elites. Individual responsibility is subordinated to group identity and systemic explanations for all social problems. The result is what I have termed the destruction of the permanent things, the systematic elimination of those enduring truths that have made civilization possible. This destruction manifests itself in the decline of education, where the great works of literature and philosophy are abandoned in favor of contemporary ideology, in the corruption of law, where constitutional principles yield to social engineering, in the weakening of family life, where traditional roles and relationships are reconstructed according to egalitarian theory, and in the secularization of culture, where transcendent sources of meaning are replaced by political activism. Yet the permanent things possess a quality that their enemies cannot ultimately destroy. They correspond to fundamental aspects of reality that no amount of ideological manipulation can eliminate. Human nature reasserts itself despite egalitarian attempts at social conditioning. The need for authority and order manifests itself even in supposedly egalitarian communities. The desire for transcendent meaning persists despite secular efforts to reduce existence to material terms. This gives us reason for hope despite the apparent success of egalitarian ideology in capturing contemporary institutions. The permanent things survive not because they are popular but because they are true, and truth has a way of breaking through even the most elaborate ideological constructions. Our task as conservatives is to preserve these truths during the present dark age and to transmit them to future generations who will once again recognize their vital importance. This transmission requires both intellectual and practical efforts. We must continue to study and articulate the philosophical foundations of conservative thought, demonstrating the superiority of traditional wisdom to contemporary ideology. But we must also live according to these principles in our own lives, creating small communities of sanity within the larger culture of confusion, raising children who understand the difference between true and false equality, and building institutions that embody conservative principles rather than merely advocating them. Conclusion. The choice before us could not be clearer. We can preserve the constitutional republic and moral order bequeathed to us by our ancestors, or we can surrender to the egalitarian ideology that promises equality but delivers only tyranny. The equality ideologues have shown us their ultimate destination, a society where excellence is punished, diversity is forbidden, tradition is eliminated, and freedom is sacrificed upon the altar of enforced uniformity. This is not progress but regression, not justice but the destruction of justice itself. True conservatism offers a different path, the recognition that authentic human flourishing requires not the elimination of differences but their proper ordering according to merit, virtue, and transcendent purpose. We must choose between the equality that destroys and the order that preserves, between the ideology that enslaves and the tradition that liberates. The permanent things await our decision, and history will judge whether we possess the wisdom and courage to defend the principles that make civilization possible. The democracy of the dead calls upon us to prove worthy of our inheritance and to transmit unimpaired to our children the precious legacy of ordered liberty that generations have died to preserve.